Welcome back to A Bite from the Money Sandwich, where we provide practical and easy to understand tips and ideas on how to manage your money better so as to let you retire with comfort and on your own terms. Hello everyone, and welcome back to 2022. And we all have our fingers crossed that it will be a better year than the previous two. With each of our podcasts to date, one of my favorite things to do was to ask each guest at the end of their interview what we called our final bite. What was the best piece of advice they had received? So we've collected these here in this one-off podcast with some wonderful insights from some very clever people, and hope you enjoy. The first final bite was from my initial guest, Jeff Thorett, a senior financial advisor and director of Everlesco Financial Services, who in his podcast provided plenty of tips and ideas around money and super, and this final bite for his best piece of advice.
I think maybe I'll go away from the financial side of things and the quotes and reflect on something that my grandmother said to me, which has always stuck with me. I had a pretty close relationship with my grandma. And she said to me, I think it was about the time I was kind of heading off to uni and moving out of home. And she said, my best advice for you is be the boy your grandma thinks you are.
Oh, yeah, okay.
So, it was a fair bit of pressure. And I think probably, I haven't always lived up to it. There's probably a few things that she didn't know, which is probably best left unsaid. But I do think it's a nice way to carry yourself is, if you would be comfortable telling your grandma or your grandma seeing your actions and your words, then it probably means it's okay and what you've done is the right thing. So, I think that was a nice piece of advice.
For our next final bite comes from David Hancock, Director of Benari Property, a property advocacy service based in Sydney, who gave us his views around sea changes, rent vesting, and the hotted property market at the moment, and where it was headed as some of his highlights. And this final bite.
I'm not sure if it's necessarily a piece of advice, but it's probably a learning. When I was younger, I lived with my grandparents for a couple of years, and as a lot of grandparents do, you tend to hear the same stories over and over. I can remember my grandfather specifically telling me that he paid his home off, many, many years before he actually retired, and that he just regretted not sort of being proactive in getting an investment strategy and potentially, maybe borrowing some extra money and purchasing investment property or investing further into shares or just being a little bit more proactive with his investment strategy. So one of the things I've kind of learned and try to adopt in my own life and certainly advising others is just to have an investment strategy and be proactive, because if you're not proactive and you're not in the game of investing, whether that's shares, property, or whatever, it's very, very hard for you to put yourself in a really strong place at retirement. So I think it's probably a learning from other people's mistakes as opposed to advice, but that's probably what I took out of that.
Next up, we hear from John Haslam, a good friend and very successful businessman who just recently retired. He provided in his podcast an insight to the challenges we all need to be aware of, as sometimes retirement can just arrive a lot quicker than expected. Let's hear from John on his best piece of advice that he received.
I think from my accountant many years ago, when he said to me, start thinking about the future now and start investing as soon as you can, even with very, very small amounts, which is how we started. Because over many years, you do see the effect of compounding, the effect of dividend reinvestment, the growth of the share market. And by putting even quite small sums away at a relatively good age, 30s, early 40s, whatever, by the time you do reach retirement age, that can have grown to quite a substantial nest egg that can give you that financial confidence to then do the other things that you want to do in retirement.
We have heard from three men, so definitely time to hear from the ladies. First up, we hear from Julia Newbold, Managing Editor of Money Magazine, Australia's most read personal finance magazine. Julia's podcast with me discussed all things money, women, and how millennials are taking more of an interest in their finances than any previous generation before them. Let's hear her final bite.
Well, when I went to England, my dad said, never let the weather put you off anything. And that was, that was great advice going to England, but it is, you've got to really treat each day as a new day, and you've got 24 hours in that day to make the most of what you have and what you can do. And, pretty much don't put off what you can do today. I think that's really important. And I also think just start early when it comes to finance, just start.
Next up is Jodie Fitzgerald, Head of Institutional Portfolio Management at Morningstar. Jodie spoke to me about the power of diversity in an investment portfolio and getting our money working harder, as let's face it, we're all living longer. Her best piece of advice that she was given was this.
Best piece of advice was ever given, and I've subsequently given it to my children, is work out what you love doing in life and then find someone to pay you to do it. And I just think, and I've said that to my kids because it really stuck with me when I was growing up. And I've said to me, I don't really care what career path you choose, whatever you want to be in life, be it, but just make sure you love it, because then if you love it, it's never a job.
Our next podcast was with Chris and Wendy Sparks, a couple always ahead of their time, as they worked remotely and acted on a sea change long before it became popular, especially during these COVID times. They've transitioned to the farm now and are about to be fully retired. So let's hear what both of Chris and Wendy's final bite were.
My dad told me many years ago, don't be a follower and be true to yourself.
Yeah.
And I think I've done that.
I know you, Wendy, and no, I totally agree. You've done exactly that. Your dad proud. Well, Chris?
Mate, I'll give you two if I can cheat. But both from my dear old dad. When I first got my first job, he said, righto, you've got to save 20% of every pay packet. And I had no idea why. And he sat down and gave me chapter and verse about how you need new tyres on your car sometimes, or you've got to fix that chipped tooth, or something goes wrong with the stove and you need to buy a new one. And haven't always been able to save 20% of a pay packet, but I've always endeavoured to save something. And if it meant cutting back on something, well, I did. And that really aided me over the years. The other bit of advice he gave me was always leave something better than when you found it.
Next up, we have Tim Henry, a financial advisor with a difference. Apart from running a very successful Melbourne-based practice called Aspire Planning, he also hosts the very popular podcast, The Grass is Greener. We heard from Tim on his thoughts and ideas for a comfortable retirement with purpose. Let's now listen to his final bite.
Well, that's a really great, you've stumped me there. Was I ready for that? What's the best piece of advice I've received? Look, to be honest, I'm going to say it's from my dad. I go back to a specific time in my life where I was under 30, and I had these plans that I was planning to take off overseas and all that sort of thing. And I got this big promotion offer at work. And I knew I was going to leave later in the year. I hadn't told work this yet, in about 6 months. It was a big pay rise, but I also knew that they were going to spend probably the 6 months training me, and I was going to leave. And I had this real quandary, and I said, it'd be great on my CV as well. And I sat down with my dad and just said, I just don't know what to do. And he said, you just got to do the right ethical thing and tell them you would have loved to take the job, but what your plans are and why you wouldn't. And it was just a great ethical piece of advice from him. And later on, when I did I did my trip overseas, and then I came back to Melbourne, I went to a job interview, got a great offer for a job, and they wanted a reference, and I gave that guy who I'd told, and he gave me the most glowing reference. And they said, we've never heard such a glowing reference. And it was because I'd done the right thing. And that was just a great piece of advice that my dad gave me at the time, because I was really tempted to take the money and get that job on the CV.
For our second last podcast for the year, we heard from Katrina Brown, the practice director of Nautilus Law Group, who's been specialising in estate planning law for over 20 years now. Katrina on our podcast talked about estate planning in easy to understand language without the whole complex legal jargon, with lots of practical tips and help. Let's now listen to her final bite.
To acknowledge you're going to die. because it's not until you acknowledge that you can have a demise that you accept that there's a problem that needs to be solved.
For our final bite, we heard from Natalie Yan-Chutonsky, the founder and CEO of Full Time Lives. Nat talked about transitioning to retirement, or as she says, transitioning to full-time living. Nat provided us with her 5 key ingredients to achieve a sustainable transition to full-time living. Let's hear her best piece of advice with her final bite.
I'd say the one thing that I keep on coming back to is something that I've learned from being a product manager, and that is to run experiments. So when we develop a new product or a service, we always break it down in terms of prototyping a product. And in this case, in transition, you are your own product. So it's actually mocking up the lifestyle that you want to create for yourself. And so I always come back to that in terms of having a hypothesis around what do you want to do and get out of it? What's your goal? And do you have the means to actually achieve it? And then testing it out and then looking at the results. So using that scientific approach of testing and learning and then analyzing what did you learn from that? I think it's a really powerful way to approach life, that you don't get too attached to the goals and dreams that you might have. It's actually making it really achievable, and you're learning and having fun along the way. So I guess it's a really simple way of looking at life, whether it's, you know, finding that next new project or opportunity, or it's changing something in your life from a lifestyle perspective. You can apply it to lots of different things. And I find that that philosophy has really helped me.
Well, we heard a wide range of final bites where our guests shared learnings they had from grandparents, parents, mentors, or even a very scientific approach to life. There were definitely some great gems in there, and ones I would like to share with my own adult children. My own final bite, especially as it's New Year resolution time, if you want the best tip that I was told in my 20s, whatever your goal is, to ensure you stay on track, you need someone to keep you accountable, a financial gym buddy, so to speak. Otherwise, left to our own devices, it usually stops after 2 or 3 months. So I hope that helps with your own New Year's resolutions this year. So I hope you enjoyed this podcast and helps provide a positive kickstart to this new year. Feel free to either email me on admin@themoneysandwich.com or visit our website www.themoneysandwich.com if you have a question or want to learn more. Want more practical, easy to understand tips and action lists to help with your money stuff? Buy my book, The Money Sandwich, available now on our website, themoneysandwich.com, as well as major online retailers. See you next time when we take another bite from The Money Sandwich.